So I'm not going to spend much time introducing John because if I got going, I would kind of burn most of his time. John Wehr is, I don't know how to say it humbly on his behalf. He's a world expert in freshwater algae. It was an incredible sequence of events which got him here to speak to us. And not only is he a world expert, but something that doesn't always come along with being a world expert is he's a great guy, and he's also a great communicator to folks who just want to hear about algae, want to hear about his experiences with algae and macrophytes. I guess he's going to talk about aquatic plants as well. So I guess it's nice that we're having John, not only because he's a world expert and a nice guy and a great communicator, but it's the day that we released our great new aquatic plant guide. As I said, I'm not going to take much time. All I will say is I've known John and our families have been intertwined for how many years now, John? Since '84. 40. So it's almost 40 years. We met each other. I was in, both of our families lived in Mary Students' residence at Western in the mid-'80s. We have two sets of kids who are about the same age. Many of you have lived this journey as well. So it's so wonderful on so many dimensions to welcome John to talk to us today. And I'll hand it over to him. And as he walks up, I'll get his slides teed up. John.
I have to thank Bob and apologize for all the sugar coating. None of that's true. It's a pleasure to get to know all of you, and frankly, I'm humbled by seeing what work you've been able to do, what great success you've been able to do by community building and working together. I'm envious. We do a little bit of work trying to assist local lake owners and lake associations, but I've never seen one with the degree of cooperation and spirit of working together before. We sometimes end up more in the antagonism side of that rather than the cooperative side of it. So what you're doing is so impressive. I was going to ask all these questions, but I'll leave it for Bob later for any of you if you want to chat. Actually, I've got to ask this question. About, I can't wait to ask it. So, about the climate, do you have ice out data?
In some newspapers, they've been collecting it. If you go to some, one of the local restaurants, in the glass container, you'll say, hey, ice out. So some of them actually go back 100 years or so or more.
It's super good.
It's pretty rare, actually, to have it for every lake.
Yeah, it's super useful. And it's a great citizen science thing that we involve people in. There are lakes in New England where they've had it prior to the beginning of the 20th century. And even my little lake that I work outside of my field station, we have data for about 50 years now. And even in that short time period, we can see a clear signal. And it's so easy to do. It's pretty hard to make a mistake. So anyway, all right. Bob, of course, couldn't wait to get his fingers in the pie and scramble with my thoughts. I was going to tell you something completely different, but he claims that there's an argument going on in the world of lake management having to do with algae bad, plants good, or plants bad, algae. I couldn't keep it straight. So I decided I'd try to pull some of those ideas together and just reflect. So I'm not going to be trying to teach you anything. It's more of a journey for me, and hopefully keep you awake for a little bit of time. So I'll just start out with the take-home messages. Am I loud enough? Yeah? Okay, thank you. So I've been working on this for these topics for a long enough time, and I'm starting to learn a few things, and probably the things that I've learned are things that I may have known at a much younger age. And that is the organisms we deal with, love, hate, observe, live with, are extremely diverse, which makes them both frustrating and fascinating. And I kept hearing this, the aquatic plants that we are interested in or that we love. I thought, boy, that's terrific. I'll point out a few examples why I think they're worth attention. And of course, I'm preaching to the choir here to some degrees, and then mention occasionally the issues that we all worry about, problems associated with plants and algae in fresh systems, and a glimmer of hope, perhaps. So, Bob has not seen this picture. This is me as a lad, my first exposure, and I think I'm 9 years old there, where my parents forced me to go to summer school instead of playing baseball. And but I was hooked. This is a scrap. It's not the picture he had at the time, me, but it's a piece of aquatic plant with something on it. And as I smiled for the camera in the newspaper at the time, I probably said something like this: "Gosh, what are all these amazing things?" And indeed, you would think that would make it, well, more than close to 60 years on, you would think I'd have an answer to that. Here we are today. Of course, I'm much wiser, right, and much more sophisticated. The microscope substantially more expensive. All of those things that should give me truth. But in fact, usually when I sit down, I say this: what are all these amazing things? The diversity is probably the reward for me, and so I struggle and join in with my students in ways that we get delights and learn things. So lesson 1 has to do with the diversity. This is just a tiny snapshot, just to give you the taste. If you haven't ever looked down the microscope and viewed freshwater algae from your lake, it's a heck of a lot of fun, and you can gain information not just by recognizing old friends, so maybe some of these you may have seen before, but what do they do in your lake? What are they doing in your river? And so that diversity is important, and they range from organisms as small as a micron, 1 micrometer, a millionth of a meter, to many meters in size. And they would all be considered loosely this funny thing we call algae. Interestingly, while they vary so much, vary in size and morphology, their color, how fast they grow, how much they grow, things of that kind. Some are motile, some are not, some are attached. Some don't even gain their energy through photosynthesis like regular plants. Some eat things, and yet they're still in that category. They're extraordinary. Their chemistry, they all differ in remarkable ways, which means knowing a little bit about their qualities allows us to understand maybe the roles they play. Another thing is that while we clearly would regard, or most so-called experts would regard these things as algae, many of them are also macrophytes. So I understand that there's concerns of invasive aquatic algae as well as invasive aquatic plants. The truth is that algae span that range, and so there are taxa species in freshwaters which are both algal and macrophyte in the same breath. So that was one thing. When I say things are diverse, these please don't, no quiz, nothing like that, but just to give you a sense, the algae span 2 domains of the tree of life. The eubacteria, the prokaryotic, they don't have a nuclei. These are the cyanobacteria, or blue-green algae as they're sometimes called. We probably know of about just under 6,000 species currently. Among all the other algal taxa, which are eukaryotic. They have a nucleus and other funny things inside. More than 55,000 species. Now that includes marine taxa, but anyway, there's a crazy list called AlgaeBase, and it gets updated every so often, and names of things are placed there. You'll notice that the different groups, here we go. The different groups of algae along the phylum or class level here have different estimated number of taxa that are out there. So their diversities differ. But leading the band in this parade, without a doubt, are the diatoms. So while you may worry more about cyanobacteria, the variety of organisms in any body of water could actually be a group that, for many ways, have beneficial effects to freshwater systems. They are the key source of nutritional food, and I'll talk a little bit briefly about that later, in fresh water and marine food webs for that matter. So of that 55,000 plus eukaryotic algae, as they're called, a large percentage of them fall into this category. That's not the whole story, because as we begin to look and use new approaches to understanding them, we can now make predictions by rates of discovery how many there may actually be in nature. In the same way as we want to know how many species of beetles there are, as Darwin would concern himself with, or whatever it would happen to be. We have estimates for that, and current estimates are substantially greater. So the estimated number of species, using all kinds of fancy methods, could be as many as 10,000 cyanobacterial species, and possibly as many as 1 million of that other more sophisticated or more complex group. So there's still much discovery to be done, and the diversity is extraordinary. So what about the macrophytes that are non-algal? Well, it turns out we don't have as good of a database right now, even though they're more easily recognized. They're large. We see them all the time. But the data I can get from a reasonably up-to-date article is maybe about 25,000 aquatic macrophytes that are flowering plants or have vascular systems. So say your potamogeton that you might have, or milfoil, that would be in that category. But there are a number of non-vascular plants. There are mosses and other species that are also macrophytes in your systems as well. So why do we care? Well, the diversity of species that we're interested in are diverse in what they are, what they do, their size, and so on, as I mentioned, but they colonize a diversity of systems. In fact, they do colonize so many different kinds of systems, it's a wonder we don't find them everywhere. And in fact, we almost do. We even find some living inside of rocks in the desert. So their diversity is extraordinary. And so it's fair to say they colonize almost every habitat on Earth, if not every habitat. And this ecological range means there's much to be learned. It's not just one monolithic thing. Another thing that's clear and mystifies me, which is why I'm saying, what are all these things? And I'll take that to my grave, is that there's so many more to discover. And so that makes it both fun and challenging. And we believe that their everywhereness is probably the result of they've found a particular place in the world that suits them just fine, and we just haven't found it yet. Or they're so good at everything that we find them everywhere. Both apply. Okay. My second lesson that I've learned, I'm not trying to teach you a thing, I'm just talking to myself, really, and hoping you're awake. And that is that I've learned by looking at these organisms, they have essential roles and different roles. One of the areas of work that I and a number of my colleagues work on is to characterize what their function is in a healthy ecosystem. And a review paper that a number of us wrote clearly indicates that the primary source of energy for, ultimately for fish, for example, in a lake or a river, comes from algae. And there's been terrific experiments to show that that energy flux up to fish is the quantity of energy they get is completely proportionate to the proportion of that comes from algae. What we've also learned, and this is a debate amongst eggheads like myself, which is that people are even saying things like fish are made out of trees. And the argument is that when leaves fall into a lake or a river, bugs eat that, and then the bugs are eaten by fish and so on. But what we've seen by many different studies now is that if you feed, say, Daphnia, or you hear of water flea, it's a little zooplankton thing that is fed on by small fish. If you feed it material primarily from, say, fallen oak leaves, they will not grow, or they will grow poorly. And the proportion, I put the graph on the right, sort of scale going up there, that ladder, the more the proportion goes from leaf or terrestrial matter to algal matter, the healthier, the more productive those organisms are. One of the reasons is that it's a much higher energy source. So just imagine if you had to eat, instead of granola in the morning, or even scrambled eggs, if that's your preference, you were to be eating fallen leaves. What you would find is you'd be eating a lot of roughage, but not a lot of energy. And so the energy source that algae provide is not only higher quantity, but higher quality. And I'll show you that in just a minute. So far, we're still vertical here. One of the ways we know this, and everyone talks about that these days in terms of a healthy diet, the importance of certain fats, fatty acids. So anybody has fish oil as part of their diet. What you're really eating is not fish oil, you're actually eating algae oil that fish acquired through the food web. And the more of these essential fatty acids that are present in food sources is a function of what proportion of certain algae they eat. We've done a whole lot of experiments to show. Any fishers here? Anybody do any trout fishing? A couple of trout fishers? Well, if you were a fisher, you would be tying flies to resemble certain insects that other fish would like to eat. And on the right-hand side here, this character is a thing called a caddisfly. Maybe I'm already telling you what you know, but these caddisflies supplement their diet even if they eat quantitatively plenty of leaves as it tumbles into a stream. If they don't eat algae, they don't grow. And we've shown that the quantity of, in this case, one particular essential fatty acid in their guts, in their tissues, is entirely a function of how much algal matter they eat. In other words, algae are critical for their growth and development. Without it, they could eat as many bits of leaves and detritus as they want. They're not going to grow. They're not going to reproduce. We've determined that they are what they eat. In fact, even organisms that are said to be carnivores eat algae. They may not do it directly, but they need it in order for, just like we do, we need a certain amount of that for healthy tissues, healthy brain function, and so on. All right. We are currently involved in a very fun project. We're reevaluating the food web in the Colorado River. We're collaborating with a number of scientists in Arizona, and we're looking at the food web downstream of two hydroelectric dams. One's called Glen Canyon Dam, the other one's called Hoover Dam. And in the tailwaters of these rivers, there is an array of organisms there, and it's been studied for many decades now since these dams were built. The problem is climate change and multiple needs by human populations in the Southwest, and with record droughts in western United States, demand for electricity, demand for water, food production, and so on, has meant that they've had to modify the amount of water released and the way in which it's done. So back in the 1980s, Aquatic macrophytes, here's where that story kind of gets interesting. The aquatic macrophytes in the Colorado River were of a given species, an alga that some of you may know of as a weed, Cladophora. But it's very common in rapidly flowing streams, and that's a picture from about 1988 from a colleague of mine. I wasn't involved in the project at that time. And on Cladophora, those healthy diatoms depended. And so the picture, little picture on the top there, is a picture of diatoms that attach to this green alga called Cladophora. And that supported the food web for a number of decades. But due to changes in river flow, the availability of water, climate change, and so on, the river is no longer that tight. And so what we find is instead of just Cladophora on the bottoms of the rock now, we have a number of new aquatic macrophytes that are dominating the flora of this river. Cara, which I think many of you have heard of, a moss called Fontanellas, a couple of flowering plants, one of them is called Zatichelia. I think the common name is horned pondweed. Do you have that in any of your lakes? Horned pondweed? Maybe not. It looks a little like a skinny podamagine. And because there is this new flora of aquatic macrophytes, what do you know? There's a new attachment of diatoms associated with that, which means we have new food web structures. Entirely because the management by the Department of Energy, the water going through the dam, changed those properties. So number one, we've determined that macrophytes are essential because they serve as the hosts for this healthy food web in the river. However, it was shaped by this new macrophyte community when water flow conditions were altered in response to climate variation and human demands for water. It's even more interesting than that, trust me. So at the top here, not every diatom is the same. Some diatoms are large, some are small, some stick to a rock, some stick out in the water, and back again in the 1980s, if you look at the two top pictures, right there, way up there, it's much easier for an insect to grab those and make more chironomids or make more whatever, aquatic insect. So it would then feed fish in the river. But what happened, so we call those high-profile diatoms, but there are also low-profile diatoms that stick really close. And they're less easily grazed by the primary grazer, the midges that lived in the river from about 1980 through about 2010. Water conditions changed, climate warming changed, volume of water changed, the flow variation in the river changed, and lo and behold, what else changed? The food web changed. Hopefully you'll never have to deal with this. I'm sure you're all concerned with invasive species. In the Colorado River, we now have an invasive snail called the New Zealand mud snail. Is it in?
Not yet.
Hopefully not yet. It's in the western North America right now. It's the cutest little thing, just a couple millimeters, but you'll get 10,000 in a square meter and they start looking a little less cute. And they feed differently. Not only that, not all fish can eat it. And so, unless you're a particular kind of fish, none of you look like that, so I'll assume not. And unless you have a particular dietary structure or feeding ability, they don't get eaten. So now some of that diatom growth is being grazed in a different way because we now have different invertebrates feeding on it. The midges have almost disappeared, and we now have snails dominating the food web, and they are consuming not the high-profile diatoms that everyone thought was important, but the low-profile, changing the base and changing the upper parts of the food web, purely due to this non-native species in response to what humans are doing. So, climate change resulted in a change in the macrophyte flora. It seemed like interesting, it's beautiful to see all these plants. However, invasive species have come in as a result or in response to that, we believe. And it's also changing the way in which food and energy is moving through the river. So, plenty for us to study. Okay, maybe something you're a little more familiar with seeing rather than the Colorado River. We do a lot of local work on HABs and also eutrophic and hypertrophic lakes. Not a surprise to anyone that algae can sometimes be a problem. There's Lake Erie on the left. I don't know how many of you, Bob, no answers from you, whether you've been to New York City Central Park, but if you ever get a chance and rent a boat, like all tourists, for thousands of international visitors to New York City, and they paddle around, this is the lake in Central Park. It has some of the highest cyanobacteria blooms with toxins of any of the lakes we study. And yet every year, people paddle around there, not realizing, although there is a sign that says, "Don't let your dog in here." It is a serious problem, and yet this is a primary tourist spot. It is a real problem. You may not have heard the story with a couple years ago of elephant deaths in Botswana due to cyanobacteria blooms. So it's not just dogs or small animals at times. When it's a severe, it can really become a substantial problem because of that. So almost every lake group that I have interactions with often use the acronym Annie, Fanny, and Mike. Anybody heard that one, maybe? It used to be called Aphanizomenon, Annie, Fanny, Mike, Microcystis. And the names have changed, but the key, the Dakota famous film, the usual suspects were usually the one on the left, which used to be called Anabina. The one in the middle is still called Aphanizomenon, and the one on the right is Microcystis. And those are the usual culprits that most people look for, and that's fine. But remember one of the early lessons I learned at age 10, there's a lot of different things out there. So yes, we have well-known species that everyone should be looking out for if you're doing monitoring to assure water quality in more eutrophic lakes. Definitely. Some produce toxins, clearly a problem. But it's frequently a mix. The pictures at the top are really for my teaching purposes more than anything. In truth, when we see an algal bloom, it usually looks like the pictures on the bottom, a mix, which means we have to be a little bit more careful in our observations. And it's not always the usual suspects. There are other species, less often publicized. Again, you don't have to even know these names, but just be aware that if someone does a lake study for you because you have cyanobacteria blooms, and you don't find the big three, Microcystis, Aphanizomenon, formerly Anabina, as a new name, but anyway, that doesn't mean you're in the clear. There are other species that also produce toxins or certainly produce surface bloom issues. The other thing that people worry about is, I've got cyanobacteria in my lake, it's ugly, it's nasty, it smells bad. True, very possible. But that doesn't necessarily mean that because species of that kind, or genera of that kind, are present, doesn't necessarily mean that they're toxic. Even species that are well known to produce toxins may only do it under certain conditions, which is why we always send our samples out for toxin analysis. It's important. Okay. Try to end on something slightly more balanced, because obviously the macrophyte algal camps have their views about what's good and bad for a lake or a pond or a river. This is a lake we've been studying for over 20 years. Several of my students are now in the lake management game, and they go and try to help folks in our part of the country how to manage the concerns of the lake owners and the residents. This is about a 8-hectare lake in the suburban areas north of New York City, and it's primarily used for recreational purposes, not for drinking water. And clearly the residents want to be able to boat in it, fishing and so on. And they also have, let's face it, some pretty expensive homes. And so they like it to look good as well, and I can't blame them. Two issues come up though in this particular system, and this is super common in our part of the country anyway. Excessive shoreline vegetation, which I know some of you are concerned, and occasional algal blooms. So we've shown you both versions of that here. So what this graph represents, nothing more than water clarity in this particular lake called North Lake over multiple years. I don't have the last couple of years, but you get the idea. It's all up and down. Because the residents are primarily interested in reducing the amount of macrophyte, the management solution that they came up with is to put in sterile carp, a pretty common approach, again, in our region anyway, to try and cut back on this. Problem is it's an imprecise science, and so sometimes these carp overgraze. We've seen it happen in several cases where the carp essentially remove all of the macrophytes to speak of. There's nothing left. And the pattern that we're seeing, and now we're seeing this up and down kind of thing happening here, the carp do a terrific job. We hope it does a good enough job. Sometimes it does too good of a job. And this releases nutrients out of the sediments, and what we end up with is not macrophytes, but cyanobacteria blooms. So we're trying to figure out, or we should all figure out, what's the balance between too few weeds, too many weeds, and so on. And so what we have recommended and what seems to be slowly working here is not just how do we do the science better, how do we do the management better, but what are the community needs? How important is it to have all of the shoreline without aquatic plants? How important is it to have clear water? And come up with some balance between these competing biological processes, which of course influences potentially competing human needs. So, we found that water clarity was positively correlated with aquatic vegetation, a good thing. Too much aquatic vegetation, the lake becomes impractical for swimming and boating. But when we remove it entirely, we get cyanobacteria blooms. So our target now in the management scheme, or my former students' management scheme, is to find a way to do this in a modest way so the lake is functionally healthy and also useful for recreational purposes. All right, so I had a bunch of take-home messages. I hope it's clear that the diversity matters. Which aquatic plant you have, or what aquatic plants you have. Fantastic, by the way, in your aquatic plant guide. Amazing. And free. Amazing. Great.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how wonderful that is. We need to do that in our area. But understanding species is tricky. Using things like iNaturalist are a great way to do that. So again, kudos to you. These aquatic plants and these algae provide ecosystem services. So there is no algae bad or plants bad. They all have positive and negative components to them. They do all create problems when they're abundant. So a modest amount is probably what we should be aiming for. Aquatic macrophytes and the algae support healthy food webs. So those of you who are concerned with healthy fisheries, this plays into that. We've learned also that once in a while, an invasive species could put a little bit of a change in your plan. And so I think some of your, I should ask ahead of time, do you have quaggas in some of
Yeah, we got Dracenids all over it. They become part of the landscape, the waterscape.
Exactly. And so when you have an unwanted visitor that doesn't want to leave, this has to be part of the plan too, because sometimes they don't. Field studies teach us a lot. So those of you who are doing all this terrific work, monitoring, making observations, this is exactly where people want to be. So again, wonderful to be preaching to the choir. I think you're doing a fantastic job. However, what I have learned, this is just me talking, is that because the environment is changing under our feet or under our boats, what we're finding is that we don't know everything. We understand what we know at time X, but time Y, all of a sudden, oh, I didn't expect those snails to be there, or the temperature to increase, or whatever happens to be. So we have to be flexible with regard to how we do these management, how we understand these things, because environmental change is a reality, and so we have that to be put into our calculations and put into our plan. Okay, back to the beginning. If we look at what I've learned so far, my lessons, I think I want to go backwards and say, what did the kid on the right learn that the kid that's currently standing in front of you should still be learning? And that is, they are amazing, they're difficult, and we need to do more observations to better understand them. So he had it right at the beginning. They're really interesting, really complex, and if I could just editorialize for a minute, I think they're also beautiful. And so the diversity of freshwater algae, to me, is at least part of the fun, is seeing what's there. So I thank you for your time, and hopefully you can give algae a positive nod once in a while. Thank you.
So questions for John?
Sir.
Can you use the mic, please, John?
Yes, sir.
Yes, you mentioned pondweed,
Yes.
and I'm from Jacksonville. And we, of course, have a cycle of Eurasian milfoil up there. And in most places, it's run its course and it's gone, and the weed that replaced it was, in fact, pondweed. The places where it hasn't disappeared are the cottages that have nice green lawns that go right down to the lake. And it's still got the Eurasian milfoil as green as grass.
So, obviously, I can't add anything to that except to say you're right. Unfortunately, I mean, gosh, this fantastic planting program that you've got here, that's tailor-made for just exactly that sort of problem. Putting in native riparian vegetation, the way I refer to it as riparian vegetation, shoreline plants, is such a pleasant as well as effective way to deal with these problems because they filter nutrients, they stabilize the land. I think you've got a customer there to buy a partner. There you go. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for that. I naively thought algae was always ugly stuff that floated on the surface. So
Another convert.
I know, yeah. So now those things I feel on my legs when I swim, I can call them aquatic plants and they're like the algae. But what causes an algae bloom to become toxic? I think heat would likely be involved, but what?
It does, yeah. In fact, a friend of mine just wrote it some years ago now. Isn't it funny how COVID sort of, I thought it was last year, and then I realized, no, it was 4 years ago, wrote an editorial in one of the top science journals called Science, and basically said, cyanobacteria, how do you quote the movie, some like it hot, and so it's true. So warming, cyanobacteria need it warm. They also need relatively stable water column, so your temperature profiles are super important because the greater the stability of the warm versus the cold water, the thermocline that we call it, helps their stability. They like it that way. But of course, none of that's going to happen without excess amounts of nitrogen or phosphorus. So whether it comes, by the way, septic systems, if that happens to be, or even goose poop for that matter, they're also terrific sources of phosphorus as well. And so nutrients, in addition to the E. coli that you're rightfully concerned about, nutrients are an enormous cause for that. If I could just tell you how bad it can get. So the cyanobacteria bloom that we get to show our students almost year-round in Central Park has phosphorus burden in this little lake year-round. Why? Because Frederick J. Olmsted, the architect who built Central Park and also several of the other beautiful parks, urban parks in the U.S., It was built in the late 1800s, and the Manhattan Island was mostly just a marsh and a rocky area, not really beautiful like Central Park looks today. So what did they do to improve the landscape? Well, there were no cars in those days. Where do you think they got their nutrients from? Horse manure, which has a very high phosphorus to carbon ratio. And so the burden of soils in Central Park is many decades, if not a century worth of creating soils there. And so this leaches in, and then is now the composition of the sediment in this lake. All lakes have a certain amount of nitrogen and phosphorus in them. The question is, what conditions allow these nutrients to come back in? And again, the discussion, just a minute, I forgot your name, is it Brett?
Yeah.
Brett, yes.
It's not
Brett.
just me though, it's not me, I'm just the messenger.
But what a great messenger. You did a great job. But the point is that this business of oxygen profiles and temperature profiles are going to tell a lot about your lake's ability to either retain the phosphorus or release the phosphorus into the water column. Add on the fact that many of you have aquatic macrophytes. Macrophytes also help to minimize the amount of phosphorus released into the water as well. It's not a simple story, but it's a pretty well established story, so that the component of the half dozen to 10 factors that are bringing the cyanobacteria into the front are pretty well known. Her other question is the trouble asking somebody who likes this stuff that you asked was what makes them toxic? So many of the cyanobacteria species and few others in fresh waters produce toxins, but those that do, even the species that are known to produce toxins don't do it all the time. And so various conditions are triggers for them to do that. And so much is known about that, but it has a lot to do with portions of their life cycle, when they bloom, and so on. But to be safe, if somebody does a water quality assessment and says, gee, you've got these fancy names, Microcystis, Aphanosomena, with Lecospermum is the new Anabina. If you find it in your lake in large quantities, they should be testing for toxins.
Okay.
But if you have beautiful slimy green things around your legs, they're not going to be producing toxins. It's a select few. And even if you have it in the water, they may not be producing it. So a test is, in my part of the world, the health department does the toxin analysis. I assume Environment Canada does, I don't know.
So you don't know just by looking at it, in other words?
Well, if one looks at it under the microscope, you have a very good probability that it can happen.
Right.
And so, yes, that's a starting point for sure. Good, great question.
So, and you talked about over-vegetation on the shoreline, but then we're promoting naturalizing our shoreline. So,
Well, if I understand again, I'm not too, I just learned from the great talk from Bob a minute ago, but my understanding is naturalizing the shoreline has to do with the landscape, not the lakescape, right? Yeah?
okay.
So you plant, so it's basically, among other things, sucking up the nutrients before those nutrients get into the lake. And they're also stabilizing that shoreline, so you're not getting the sediment stuff flowing into the lake with a lot of rainfall.
Yeah, probably need to clarify. Yeah.
So I'm on Sturgeon Lake, and I'm sorry. I'm on Sturgeon. I'll stand up. I'm on Sturgeon Lake, and maybe like 15 years ago, the zebra mussels were. Sturgeon's always been a little murky, and then for a couple of years, it was clearer than I've ever seen it, and it was really like it wasn't right. And then a few years after that, we had more aquatic plants than we've ever had.
Mm-hmm.
Now it's kind of gone back. But the zebra mussels are still there. 10 years ago, they were on every pipe, every rock. You could hardly swim. Now they're just part of the system.
Yeah.
So what's the future for that? Are they just going to be part of the ecosystem?
I think the short, so the if I can try and paraphrase the question, was Sturgeon Lake, it's called? Sturgeon Lake, some years ago was invaded by zebra mussels or quagga mussels. And as always happens in the Great is it clarifies the water. They're filter feeders, so they pull the phytoplankton out of the water, and they use that as their food. And that's a common pattern. The pattern I'm less familiar with was, he said some years later, probably due to water clarity, the aquatic macrophytes grew up because there's now more light penetrating through the water column, and the macrophytes came in, and apparently, I don't know if this is a fact, apparently the zebra mussels are declining now. That part of it, I don't know the answer, but actually we have a clam mussel expert standing next to me, so I'll pass that one.
I mean, as John said, and it often happens with invaders. Big boom initially, and then a response to that, and what you just described happened in Lake Erie.
Yes.
You know, incredible increased clarity in Lake Erie. People loved it. People went from hating the zebra to loving them over a period of the first few years. But then there's that bounce back as the food web kind of gets used to that and its predators and such. So yeah, it's most places now, in Kawartha Lakes and beyond, it's part of the woodwork, or the waterworks, I guess.
Yeah.
And it'll stay that way.
But what scientists call a new stable state may actually be, in some regards, healthier than it was during that boom period, because the lake system was actually suffering from a food lack. There wasn't enough to support the planktonic environment at all, because the zebra mussels were pulling it all out of the water column. What happened in Lake Erie is worse than what you're describing, because now they have cyanobacteria blooms as much or more than they did in the past.
But yeah, they talked about at the time, well, let's relax the sewage treatment standards in Lake Erie, because we need to get more nutrients in there, because the zebras are sucking. So it's always dangerous when humans start becoming ecosystem engineers.
Yeah.
Nature's far better at it.
There was a question that I keep ignoring. Did you have a question?
Well, recently I heard an interesting talk about the algae blooms in without phosphorus.
Yes.
When the diatoms get killed, mainly by salt, calcium getting into the water and killing off all the diatoms with heat bacteria. So algae blooms not related to phosphorus loading.
Yeah.
Can
So.
you repeat that, John, just so others?
Yes. So the question was, or the observation was that there are some reports in lakes where algae blooms are occurring where there isn't the usual increase or response to elevated phosphorus, for example. It's not that they're smart, it's that they've had almost 3 billion years to evolve. And so there are cyanobacteria and other algae that have different ecological niches that are able to capitalize on this altered, in this case, chemical landscape. And one of my students right now is working with an alga that people have only vaguely reported in systems where there have been management issues, and has a different array of phosphorus and nitrogen requirements, and again, occurring in abundance. Undoubtedly, in the case of diatoms, most diatoms, but some like a lot of phosphorus. Some diatoms are quite happy with low phosphorus. The question is, are the species in the lake we're talking about now, are they a nuisance or are they beneficial to a healthy food web? And that's something that a person could figure out pretty easily with a bit of a survey and a bit of working. One more, yeah.
Yes.
One more.
In
Quickie.
defense of the phosphorus chlorophyll relationship, the original models were developed on integrated water samples over the Limnion, whereas the blooms that are occurring now is the cyanobacteria in the surface water. So that little bit of scum contributes very little to an integrated value.
Good point, yes. So, you probably heard that. So a lot of the original models of phosphorus versus chlorophyll as a measure of algal productivity was based on samples collected throughout the water column, which we call an integrated sample. That's completely true. The only quibble I'll make with that observation, it's not a quibble, just a expansion on your point, is that in systems like that, many cyanobacteria spend some of their time throughout the water column, and then at other times find their way to the surface. There's even a group of cyanobacteria that do both, that live on aquatic plants during the early part of the year, and then when they've acquired all the phosphorus they need down in the deep water, they release themselves and come up to the surface where they can get more light. And some even migrate throughout the water column so they can get the best of both worlds. Plenty of phosphorus down here, plenty of light up here. And some will even do it diurnally. Okay, yeah.
Okay, John's going to stick around for a few minutes after if you want to chat with him. But for now, we have to call the meeting. So wonderful to see everybody here, and incredible talk from John. John, we have a small gift in recognition of this that you and I can polish off later. So thank you so much, John.